let's go ahead and get started. I'm Rabbi Ruti Regan, and this is our ongoing Matan webinar series in topics in inclusive Jewish education. Today we're going to talk about including learners with communication disabilities in the Jewish conversation. We decided to do this topic because there are a couple of trends in Jewish education that make it important. One is that since we want students to focus on meaning and understand what they're learning and think about it and process it, we're using a lot more discussion-based means of teaching and instruction than we used to. And another trend is that we're including a wider range of learners in our learning communities, including people with disabilities. And a lot of people have disabilities that can affect their communication. People with intellectual disabilities might need more processing time. People with social anxiety or selective mutism can have problems in these types of things. Autistic people can communicate in all kinds of atypical ways. So there's all kinds of great reasons we're using discussion-based modalities of instruction, and they require some attention to thinking about how do we do that in a way that's inclusive so that everybody has access to learning from and collaborating with peers, expressing their opinions, engaging with the material in these kinds of ways that we really value. So before we get into the meat of it, just want to note that I really welcome your questions. I want this to be useful to you. And please ask anything you want to know about what I'm saying, anything that isn't clear that you would like more information about. Please ask questions in the chat box at any point. You're not interrupting. I'm watching the chat box. I want your questions, and I'll incorporate it into this presentation in a way that makes sense as I see your questions in the opening. So please do ask questions, and I've put a reminder on every slide because I mean it. Okay, so in terms of communication, how do we make sure we're being inclusive? I think that one way is to focus on a general principle involved, which I think of as the golden rule of communication. Golden rule of communication is that everybody does their job. And not everyone communicates in the same way, but everybody can work at the conversational work that's involved in being understandable and being reciprocal. So what do I mean by everyone does their job? Well, I think everyone has two basic communication jobs. One is listening, working to understand what the other person is telling you and making sure that you're understanding them and taking what they say seriously, thinking about it. The other communication job that I think everybody has is telling. And telling is working to be understandable to the person you're communicating with, working to communicate in a way that they can understand, whether that's using words that they know, using visuals, using whatever supports. But whoever we're interacting with, whatever their communication skills or abilities are, it's always our job to listen, and it's always our job to do the telling work. And sometimes when people have disabilities, people forget this and maybe treat it as solely the disabled person's job to learn how to be normal, and then we'll communicate. Or sometimes people forget that disabled people can communicate and are communicating even when it's not typical. And we're going to talk some more about details and how to mitigate that. So what is listening? Listening is working to understand what someone is communicating to you, however it is that they're communicating. And I put on the slide some questions that you can use to sort of guide your listening. What are they trying to tell you? How do you know? How can you check? What else can you do if you're not sure? So listening is not passive, listening is active. Listening can require a lot of creativity, and listening sometimes involves talking, asking questions, checking your guesses, that sort of thing. Telling is working to be understandable. And I didn't want to call this speaking because it's not always speech. Telling can take different forms. But so when we're working on telling, being understandable to others, some questions that can help guide that are, what do I want the person I'm communicating with to understand? Do they understand what I'm telling them? How do I know? How can I check? And how can I make what I'm saying more understandable if there seems to be a disconnect? So sometimes we do this with spoken words. I think this is kind of the default that most of us understand really well. Because when we grow up, we're taught, use your words, here's how you talk to people. And we spend a lot of time working on our conversation skills that happen using typical speech. So I think we don't necessarily always think of this explicitly, but that it's your job to be understood. It's your job to understand, it's your job to be understandable, it's your job to listen, it's your job to tell, is kind of understood implicitly by a lot of us when we're using speech. But when it gets into other means of communication or atypical communication, sometimes we need to be a little more intentional about it, because communication can look different for some people. And I've included some examples here. And this is not exhaustive, it's just a few common examples, is that not everyone can talk. Some people who can talk have speech that is not necessarily very clear or quick, and it can be hard to talk. Some people use body language much more than they use words. Some people use repetitive or scripted speech. Like instead of making their own sentences, they might repeat phrases that they learn from books or television in a way that is unusual but also meaningful. Some people communicate using communication devices, or by typing or by writing, or in different ways at different times. Some people have receptive communication differences. Some people have difficulty understanding spoken language, or might need captions or simple language or different kinds of accommodations. Communication looks different for different people. And that's okay. And we even see this in the Torah. Moses' communication was not typical. And this line, this verse, is from the story at the burning bush. God told Moses that he was going to go confront Pharaoh and that he was going to lead the people out of Egypt, out of slavery. Moses was really wary about this because he knew, I have never been a man of words, either in times past or now that you've spoken to me. I'm slow of speech and slow of tongue. So Moses knew that his communication was not typical. It was not communication that people usually respected very much. And he was very worried that the Israelites wouldn't listen to him and that Pharaoh would laugh at him and not listen to him. Like, who am I who speaks this way to confront Pharaoh? Who would listen to me? And I think that this is a very realistic fear for a lot of people in our communities and in society at large. And I think we should be very careful that we don't act like Pharaoh. We don't dismiss people whose communication or speech is unusual. We make sure we're listening. We do our job. We act like Jews who believe that we're all created, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. So Moses' communication wasn't typical. A lot of people's isn't, and it's okay. But one thing is universal. And the thing that is universal is reciprocity. Communication is a two-way street. It's a reciprocal process. Everyone can communicate in some sort of expressive way. Everyone can communicate in some sort of receptive way, and everyone can work at mutual understanding and figuring and working to understand what is going to make communication work in this conversation. So the details vary. The details are not one size fits all. The thing is that is one size fits all. So communication is a collaborative effort, and we need to do our job and respect the work that other people are doing. So when we don't understand what someone else is saying, what someone else is telling us, no, sorry, we shouldn't just give up and be mad at them for not understanding, especially if they're a kid in our class or an adult we're teaching. When someone doesn't understand us, and it's a relationship that we're in for good reasons, it's our job to work to be more understandable. And to think about, like, where's the disconnect? What does this look like to them? How do I know? What can I do about it? When we attend to our job of working to be understandable, a lot of things become possible. Flip side of that is doing our job when we don't understand what someone is saying, what someone is telling us. So I've included here this symbol that it's in the symbol sticks library. What it means officially in their rubric is, what did you do last night? And I swear for all the world, this looks to me like it means, did you steal the moon, or where did you put the moon? And the reason I put it here is it kind of reminds me of, we don't always understand what someone is saying, but the fact that we don't understand someone doesn't mean it's meaningless. It means that we don't know what they mean. And I think that that can be counterintuitive, even with speech, but especially with atypical communication. Just bearing in mind that I may not understand this, but presuming that it's meaningful will help me to understand it. Communication works when everybody does their job, and it works better when we develop a social norm in the spaces we're responsible for, that everyone does their communication job. It's always your job to listen. It's always your job to work to be understandable, and we work together to have a reciprocal conversation. This is something that gets easier with practice, and it's something that gets easier when it's a strong normative expectation. And we don't put the work all on the disabled people, or we don't put the work all on the typical communicators. So again, when disability is involved, sometimes we have to be a bit more intentional about this. It's good to be intentional in general, but especially when there's a communication difference, there's some explicit things to pay attention to that can be helpful. One is presuming competence. And this is a framework that comes from the disability community and the non-speaking community in particular. And I'll talk about that a bit more on the next slide. But it's a really important thing to keep in mind. Do your listening job. Be intentional about figuring out what your listening job is in the context of how this person communicates. Honor their telling work. Both in the sense of listening to them, but also in the sense of acknowledging that they're doing work and respecting the work that they're doing as an atypical communicator. So presuming competence comes out of the non-speaking community, because a lot of people who are unable to speak or unable to say very many words tend to be presumed not to understand language, tend to be presumed not to have anything to say, and are presumed not to understand or care about what's going on around them. And that's usually not true. Some people do have really big language disabilities, but a lot of people, if somebody can't talk or can't talk much, all that tells you is they can't talk. It doesn't tell you what they understand. It doesn't tell you what they're capable of understanding. And it doesn't tell you what they're capable of communicating with appropriate support. So presuming competence means remembering that everyone has thoughts, taking everyone seriously as a communicator, and continuing to work at finding effective ways to listen to them and finding effective ways to support them in expressing themselves. So people don't always know how to express themselves. We don't always know how to listen, but we should always care and we should always take them seriously as people who have thoughts, feelings, and perspectives that matter. Again, we need to remember to do our listening job for everyone. When we're not understanding, we need to keep doing our listening job and to make sure we're not dismissing it as meaningless. We can't wait for people to become typical communicators before we listen, because sometimes people never become typical communicators. Sometimes people never speak or never speak typically. And it's really tragic when people end up going their whole lives without ever being listened to. And even beyond that, regardless of what skills someone may have in the future, people are people now with whatever skills and ability they have, and people need to be listened to, taken seriously and communicated with. So it's our job to keep looking for ways to find ways to listen that will work. So we don't always know what someone is thinking, but we should always presume that they are thinking. And this slide, included more as notes that you can, just things to keep in mind when people don't have a clear form of communication or when you're having trouble understanding what someone means. Maybe they mean, where did you put the moon? Maybe they mean, what did you do last night? But they mean something, even if what they're doing is pointing in the moon in ways that we find confusing. So the other side of this, there's a part that's about listening and there's a part that's about respect. Don't ignore their telling work. Something that happens a lot when people have a communication disability is that if the typical ways to communicate don't work well for them, they often try really hard to communicate in atypical ways. Like, for example, somebody who can't form their own sentences and use typical speech might try to communicate by pointing at things, making vocal approximations instead of saying words, or they might use phrases they've memorized from other settings, sort of approximate what they want to say or mean something to them. And when people try their best to communicate in the ways that are available to them and ways that work with their body and brain, this is often treated as meaningless. It's often treated as a behavior problem, and it's often not respected in an attempt at communication. So when somebody's communication is not typical, it's really important to be very proactive about watching and listening for things they're doing that may be attempts at communication. And it's important to respect them as communication and not treat them as like bad behavior or meaningless nonsense. And it's important to respect their efforts and make it clear to them that we're respecting their efforts, and to keep trying to respond to them as communication. Even when we're not successfully listening and understanding, responding to communication as communication still matters, because that communicates respect and it makes it much more possible for people to keep trying. So make sure that you're honoring someone's telling work and that you're looking for it, you're watching for it, and you're responding to it in a reciprocal way, even if you're not totally sure you're getting it right. Show that you care, show that you're listening, and say thank you for trying. Respect it, understand how hard this is, don't give up. Some things that are often worth saying and that you shouldn't assume go without saying is, I don't understand what you're saying yet, but I do care. Or your opinion is important to me. I want to listen to you. I'd like to understand this. I'm going to keep trying. I think you're trying to tell me something. Because if you don't tell people that you understand that what they're doing is communication, they might not know. Because there are probably a lot of people in their lives who think that their attempts at communication are either meaningless or a behavior problem. So if you know it's communication, tell them. make it clear. It doesn't go without saying, and saying it can make a transformative difference. So another thing to keep in mind that can sort of help you stay on the right path is silence is not absence. This is also another truism that comes from the non-speaking and atypical speech community. So when somebody is not responding in a way you understand, you don't know what they're thinking, and you need to remember that they're in the room and that they're a person. Err on the side of assuming that they're capable of understanding you and have opinions about what you're saying, and never ever talk about people like they're not there. Talk about people with the assumption that they're in the room, they're listening to you, and they care and they understand what you're saying about them. Because a mistake in that direction is a lot less harmful. And if you treat someone like you don't think they're a person, they notice that even if they don't understand speech. So be really careful about that. Silence is not absence. Treat people like people, even if you don't understand any of their communication and they're not responding to you in any way that you understand or that you understand is conveying understanding. Silence is not absence. So what do we do about this in practice? First of all, there's a lot that we don't know, just because, and I say this all the time, the legacy of exclusion and people with communication disabilities either being kept out of school or being allowed into classrooms but not really participating fully is that there's a lot of skills we don't have. There's a lot we don't know yet about what kind works as inclusive methodology. But there are certain things we do know, and there are a lot of things that are worth trying and that can inform our sort of process of trial and error that will get us to a more solid ground to communicate on. So if it's hard, it's not you, and there's things we can do. So one thing to keep in mind is that a lot of this will always involve guessing. When somebody communicates in ways that are not typical, it can take a lot of guessing and trial and error to figure out what they mean and to figure out how to plug them into a conversation with others. So effective guessing is a really important skill for us to develop as educators, as is error correction. So be clear about what you know and what you don't, what you know, how you know it, and what's a guess. We need to do our best to make good guesses, to check our guesses, and to continue to improve our guesses. We're not going to know with certainty. We're going to need to make assumptions. We need to understand that they're tentative and continually check our assumptions. And as we're doing that, there's some different things we can try. People who have trouble understanding, or people who have trouble communicating their understanding, might have language disabilities that mean that they need certain kinds of language in order to be able to understand and engage. And there's no universal here. Some people who have communication disabilities don't have receptive language problems at all, but some people do. Some people find simpler language easier to understand, like, as simple words as possible, plain language, not technical, abstract, or really specific stuff. For some people, that's make or break for their ability to understand and participate. And some people find simple language really confusing. Some people find precise technical language easier to understand. So if somebody doesn't seem to understand technical language, try simpler language. If they don't seem to understand simpler language, try technical language. And if they don't seem to understand either, vary your approach, sort of hedge your bets and alternate between both and keep trying. Also, the language that people need to use in order to communicate is not necessarily the same as the language they need to hear in order to understand. So technical language, say, let me think of an example. So do I say, for instance, if I'm talking about teaching, one way I could talk about it is to say, you know, we tend to teach in ways that involve having our students talk to each other. That's like a simple language way of putting it. A more technical way of putting it is we tend to use discussion-based instructional modalities. Another example of technical versus plain language is, you know how when you have a software license agreement, there will often be a lot of dense legalese, and sometimes there will be a plain language summary of the gist of what it contains. Or sometimes if there's a ballot measure in your state, there will be like this technical legalese language for the proposed amendment. And then maybe the League of Women Voters will have a simple language version explaining what the resolution would do. Does that make sense? So another thing thank you. Okay, so another thing it's really important to do is to address people directly. Even if they've never responded in a way you understand, even if you're not sure that they understand anything you're saying, continuing to address people directly, like to ask them questions, ask if they have something they'd like to say, and so on. It's really important to do that because if nothing else, it communicates to them that you care what they think and that you're thinking of them as part of the conversation. Even if that's all you're getting, it matters, and it leaves open a bridge that will make them much more likely to be motivated to keep trying and to trust you enough to keep trying and to communicate in ways that might work for them. And this is simple, it's concrete, and it's something that, since we're so socialized to ignore people with communication disabilities, it might not be something that happens automatically. So this is something to pay attention to. Are you addressing directly people whose communication is less typical or who you're not sure understand you? Another thing that can help us to form guesses and to give people a way into communicating is the 7-second rule plus. So 7-second rule is when you're teaching, when you're addressing a class, or even an individual person, when you ask a question, wait at least 7 seconds before going on. Because when you ask a question, you already know what the question is and sort of can anticipate some possible answers. The person you asked or the people you asked don't know the question already. They're processing it. And the pause can feel awkward. It can feel like they need clarification. And our natural response can be to sort of jump in and clarify or ask differently or worry that we've offended them. But if we do that, it tends to be overwhelming and prevent them from being able to answer. So it's important to, just in general, wait 7 seconds and give people time to think. And if that's not working, wait longer. Because a lot of people with disabilities need more time, either to process what they want, the question and what they want to say, or to do the physical act of communicating. For people who have trouble finding words or formulate or have to be very focused to be able to speak clearly, it can be slower. And for people who use communication devices or iPad apps to communicate, formulating sentences that way is a lot slower than speech. So we've got to give people time. And it can take some trial and error to figure out how much time is enough. But realizing that people need processing time, some people need more, and trying and experimenting to find what time will work. Sometimes all people need to be able to participate is more time. So yeah, also another thing is that one way we try to be fair in classrooms and class discussions sometimes is by limiting the number of minutes somebody's allowed to use speaking. And for typically developing people, that can be a good way to ensure fairness, but that doesn't necessarily work when someone has a communication disability, because some people just need to be more circuitous or like sort of dance around the point and be tangential before they can get to it, or think out loud. Some people take longer to do the physical act of speaking or to form sentences in their communication devices. Some people need to speak more in order to participate equally because the context they're living in might be so different. Like, people who are typically developing have a lot of shared experiences that they can reference without really having to take time explaining them. People whose experiences are less typical may need to do more explaining in order to be understood, which also takes more time. So fairness and equal participation in a conversation does not always look like everybody spending the same number of minutes talking. It looks like people having equitable opportunities to express themselves, which sometimes looks like the same amount of time and sometimes doesn't. Another thing to do in our guesswork or process of trial and error is try speeding up and slowing down. Some people have trouble understanding when things are happening too quickly, and slowing down, giving them processing time, can make a huge difference. This is not universal. For some people, when things happen too slowly, it means that it can't hold their attention and they're unable to understand. So for some people, slower is necessary. For some people, faster is necessary. And if we don't know how somebody's dealing with it, it can be really helpful to try both and see whether one or another speed makes a difference. Another thing is that for some people with attention issues, captions are helpful because you can scroll back up and see what you missed. Not directly the same thing, but since I mentioned attention issues, I thought might help to mention that can also help. Another thing to think about when we're doing our trial and error of communication, and this is sort of our telling work, being understandable. Sometimes things need to be made more basic. Sometimes people might not have background to understand something, or might need things explained a little more introductory language, simpler language. Sometimes really thinking about, is this an appropriate level? What new things might someone need to learn in order to understand this? Does it need to be more basic? Can make a huge difference. And this is an assumption we need to be real careful with, because when people have communication disabilities, often the default assumption is that it's because they don't understand and that it needs to be more basic. And this can be like a cycle of low expectations that becomes self-reinforcing because people don't have the opportunity to engage in more things. So this is something we should try. It should not be our only tool. And it should especially be something that we seek out information about before we try this. Because sometimes the issue is not that it's too advanced. Sometimes the issue is that it's too simple. It's not an appropriate level. And sometimes things need to be made more advanced. So if easier isn't working, try harder. Because sometimes when people don't respond, it's because what you're asking is too basic to hold their attention. It's like so boring and simple that they just can't engage with it. It can be like literally impossible for people with certain types of attention issues to keep paying attention to something like that. Or it can also be something that just feels really insulting. And people who feel insulted and disrespected are often not going to feel safe or motivated to try to communicate with you and learn with you. For instance, a kid who has a communication disability is in their 6th year of Hebrew school, learned the alphabet when they were 3, and is still being taught it every year because people are assuming they don't know it and can't learn anything else, may not be super engaged with the zillionth alphabet lesson, and they may not be super responsive to communication attempts, and making their alphabet instruction more basic is not going to be the solution there. Giving them something that's appropriate for where they're at is a better approach. So if easier isn't working, try doing something harder. If an introductory level isn't working, try something more advanced. People can surprise you. Okay, so another thing that we can do is ask. Because some people know a lot about their communication needs, but have a lot of trouble initiating communication. Some people can tell us how they communicate if we ask them, or if we give them a list of options. This can be an issue both because some people have trouble initiating and because some people don't know if it's safe to tell us. Because telling people what you need when it's atypical is very risky and people don't always respond well. For the reason we were talking about, like, atypical communication attempts are often dismissed as meaningless or bad behavior. And somebody who has been through that a zillion times may not want to risk it again with you, because even if you would never treat them that way, they can't read your mind and have to kind of go based on their experience. So asking people about how they communicate and making some suggestions and asking what they think work for them. People can't always tell you, people don't always know, but sometimes they do, and it's worth asking. It's also worth asking, their other teachers and parents, other people who know them, because sometimes they know. That said, you have to be careful with that. You have to realize, people can advocate for their kid, but you can't really be someone else's voice. And sometimes parents and caregivers are right, and sometimes they're not. When I've given this talk in Berkeley, one thing I've said is, I think there's a number of parents who you interact with who would swear up and down that their kid hates sugar and television. Maybe sometimes it's true, but often it's not. So seek out information from other people in their life, but don't treat it as written in stone, and do your own investigating, because sometimes people surprise you. And there's also a trust issue with families, because families who think that their kid is communicating often get told that they're imagining it. So asking families can be a really powerful way of signaling that you believe that their kid is capable of communicating and that you care about what they know about their kid's communication. So it's a lot of power in asking. So another way to make good guesses and to check our guesses and to support additional communication is to ask people yes or no questions. You can get a lot of mileage out of them if you're creative and intentional. So you can make guesses about what someone's thinking, ask yes or no, and point at things, this, yes or no. And keep in mind that if someone can only say yes or no, they depend on you to ask the right questions. So make good guesses about what they might want to be asked and what they might be thinking. And if you have somebody in your class or your program for whom this is true, make thinking about what yes or no questions you might want to ask part of your lesson plannings, because it makes a really big difference when people depend on you asking them if you've planned to ask them. So how do we make yes or no answers possible? Some people can just say yes or no. Others can't or don't know how yet. Something you can do to help teach certain people how is to say, here's a yes or no, here's a question, yes or no. Like, are you talking about lunch, yes or no? for some people, having the options offered makes an answer possible. Some people say yes or no in different ways, or have idiosyncratic ways of saying yes or no. So this is another place where asking people about their communication can be really helpful. One thing you can do is you can say, can you show me yes? Can you show me no? Because some people, have a hand sign or a facial gesture or something they use to communicate yes and no. And some people, who can only say yes, no, might not be able to tell you this is how I say yes or no unless you ask. So another thing you can do is multiple choice questions. Two choice questions or multiple choice questions other than yes or no, like this or that, can be really powerful. I know that bubble sheets aren't cool, but multiple choice questions can be a really powerful assessment tool, especially for people who don't have open-ended communication, if we're careful to write good questions. And multiple choice questions don't have to be, shallow. And it's also not just assessment. You can ask about preferences. You can ask about opinions. You can offer choices. You can do polls of, so who agrees? Raise your hand if you agree. Now raise your hand if you disagree. You can do this as a whole class thing too. Like, go to this side of the room if you think Isaac was fooled. Go to that side of the room if you think Isaac wasn't fooled. So giving multiple choice ways of communicating opinions and understanding and preferences can be really powerful. When people don't have their own expressive words to use, sometimes we've got to use ours. And being creative about multiple choice questions and different ways to answer multiple choice questions can enable a lot of participation and expression. It can also enable us to check our guesses and develop a clearer sense of what someone does and doesn't understand and tailor our communication attempts accordingly. So another method we can use, and this is a really powerful means of checking guesses, is more open-ended types of two-choice questions. And this is, we offer one option and then say, or something else. And then if the answer is something else, we keep making guesses and getting closer until we get it right. This doesn't always work, but it really often does, even with people with very little other communication. So do you want X or something else? Are you saying X or something else? I think you're saying X. Am I getting that right, or did you mean something else? This can also be helpful even like with young children who just kind of haven't figured out words yet. People with atypical communication and any number of other things. It's a very good way to check our guess and use our words to help other people use theirs. So you make a guess and then you check your guess and you keep repeating it until you get it. So here's an example of how this could play out in a Torah class. So Mora Sarah's leading a class on the Parsha, the weekly Torah reading. And there's a student in her class, Shira, who's autistic and has what's called delayed echolalia, which means that she doesn't tend to use her own words very much. She repeats a lot of phrases that she heard somewhere else. And in her case, she often means something by her delayed echolalia, but people often don't realize it's meaningful or understand what she means. So here's an example of how using this tool with someone who communicates that way can be a really good way to clarify. So Mora Sarah says, why did Joseph's brothers get so mad at him? Shira says, got milk? Like a commercial. Mora Sarah asks this question to clarify. Shira, are you talking about milk? About something else. Sharon says, Parsha, got milk? Mora Sarah replies, do you think his brothers were angry about milk or do you mean something else? Are you talking about something Joseph had or something else? Had coat, got milk. I think you mean that they were angry because he had the coat of many colors and they didn't. Is that right, or do you mean something else? No, Joseph didn't share. Do you mean that they were mad because he didn't share his coat, or something else? Because he didn't share, right? So she sort of made guesses based on the content and what she knows about Shira. And then she says, thank you, Shira. What does everyone else think about Shira's idea? Were Joseph's brothers mad because he didn't share? And so then Morasera has done her job listening to Shira, sorry. She's listening to Shira. She's helped Shira to effectively do her telling job. And they both worked together to do the telling and the listening. And now Shira's idea about the Torah reading has been brought into the conversation, and other people can discuss it because Morasera helped them listen to her. And it's really important to do that as educators, to both do the listening and to help our other learners do the listening and engage with what other people are sharing. So if Morasera hadn't realized that Shira might be saying something meaningful, this is another way this could have gone, and a way it often does go. So say Morasera, again, starts with the same question. Why did Joseph's brothers get mad at him? And Shira gives the same response that is not necessarily easy to understand on the face of it. Shira says, why did Joseph's brothers get mad at him? Got milk? Morasera thinks that this is just like random disruptive silliness and says, Shira, stop being silly. Got milk? And then Morasera thinks, well, maybe she's asking for milk. Shira, it's not time for snack. We'll have milk later. No snack. Got milk? Shira, we need to use our inside voices. Got milk? Look at the schedule. We drink milk at snack time in this classroom. It's not time for milk, Shira. Got milk? Shira, I think you need a timeout. Come back when you can sit nicely and use your inside voice. So in this example, which again, it's very common, this is a mistake I've made. This is a mistake I think most people have made, which is that Shira is trying really hard to communicate, even when she's not being listened to. She's getting increasingly frustrated, and Morasera is assuming that Shira's not doing her job, and that what Shira is doing is inappropriate and needs to be corrected and stopped. And she, in this example, is really actually, in some ways, trying to understand. She's thinking about what Shira's needs are. Like, first of all, maybe Shira needs to be redirected and reminded of what's appropriate and what's not. It's like her first guess at what Shira's support needs might be here. The second guess is that Shira might be confused about the schedule, might need to be reminded that it's not time for milk, but we'll have snack later. And then Morasera is guessing that, well, maybe Shira didn't understand that in a spoken way. Maybe she needs to look at the schedule in order to understand what's expected now. And these are all potentially really appropriate supports. And the missing element here is that Morasera forgot to listen. She didn't do her job in the conversation of trying to understand what Shira was thinking, what she was trying to communicate, and why. And she didn't really work at finding ways to understand Shira, even though she meant really well and was doing her best to accommodate her and to support her needs and include her. It went really wrong because she didn't listen. She didn't do her listening job. And I think that this is so normative in our culture that most of us sort of default to doing this. So being intentional about listening can help a lot. And especially using this method, is this meaningful communication? What do they mean? How can I check? Makes a lot of things possible. And then we can bring people into the conversation instead of putting them in timeout. Another way to think of this is that everyone has one communication type of communication job in a conversation. We have our telling job and our listening job. Be understanding and being understandable. Teachers also have another set of communication jobs, which is that it's our role to facilitate and support communication, to teach communication skills for telling, to teach people methods they can use to talk to other people in our group in ways that are understandable, teaching communication skills for listening, teaching our learners how to listen to each other, and providing multiple ways to communicate. So we have a lot of power and responsibility to set the stage and to teach people how to do this. We also have a lot of power. We're going to make a lot of mistakes, but when the mistakes that we make trying really hard to support and teach communication are worth making, and the mistakes we make are the price we pay in order to get it right. So part of teaching, our teaching responsibility is teaching all learners to do their communication jobs. So everyone does their listening job and their telling job. Kids with and without disabilities learn to understand each other and to be understood by each other, which means that sometimes that's speech, but we also teach people to listen to different kinds of communication. And when people whose communication is less typical, we also support them in learning less typical communication skills. Because whether or not someone learns typical speech, they need communication skills that work for them. And people with atypical communication need atypical communication skills, and they need us to help them learn that, because disability doesn't come with a manual. It doesn't make people less in need of instruction. We teach typically developing kids communication skills in an ongoing way constantly. And people whose communication looks different also need us to teach them and also need our support in practice and learning to be understandable. And that's part of what was going on in that example, is that Maura Sarah was supporting Shira's communication, but she was also teaching her things about other people's perspective and about narrowing it down. And they were both learning to communicate with each other. And we need to realize that everyone's learning to communicate and to teach communication in an inclusive way, both for receptive communication, understanding, and expressive communication, being understandable. Another thing worth mentioning about this is that kids with disabilities don't necessarily automatically understand other kids with disabilities, even the same disability, and all the more so different disabilities. So like inclusion skills need to be taught inclusively. Kids with disabilities need to learn to understand kids with disabilities and adults with disabilities just as much as typically developing kids do. And again, a lot of this is trial and error. A lot of this is, making our best guess, trying our best, checking in with each other about guesses that people in our community of practice are making, and figuring out what works. Trial and error can be kind of hard on us emotionally. It can be hard on your identity as an educator. We don't like making mistakes. We don't like it when we're really trying hard to work with a kid and it's not working and they're upset and we're upset. And we like success. And I think this can be even harder often for really experienced educators, because we get used to a certain level of reliable success and a certain level of things going right. And when we're more inclusive, and teaching and including people who have not traditionally been included, and we don't personally have as strong skills for, and our mentors may also not have strong skills for, and there may not even be well-developed methods for, we're going to make a lot more mistakes. We're going to be unsuccessful a lot more often. And it can feel like we're going backwards. It can feel like we're getting worse as educators, or that there's new problems. And it really helps to keep in mind that it's not that we're getting worse, it's that we're doing something harder. And it's not that we're failing kids with disabilities more, it's that we're noticing the failures more. Because when kids are just flat out excluded, we can pretend that they're off somewhere else being taught, but it's not true. We just don't have to see it. But when we bring people into community, we feel all the failures firsthand. And that doesn't mean things are getting worse. It just means that we're attending to things that are harder and very necessary. So the error is part of the trial and error. The mistakes that we make are worth making. And we need to get into the mindset of honoring partial successes and celebrating the efforts, even when we're not everywhere we want to be yet. And when we all keep trying, and when we can all tolerate the frustrations involved and the emotionally difficult things involved, a lot of communication becomes possible, especially over time, especially as we build inclusive culture and get everyone on board trying their best to do their telling job and their listening job for everyone. A lot of things become possible, both in our specific educational contexts and in the world as we support each other in making these attempts and learning from one another. So we all have to keep trying, and there's a lot of success available. So we have a few minutes left. So at this point, I'm going to pause for, are there any questions people would like to ask or comments people would like to make before we end? Yeah. So, question. You talked about students with communicated related disabilities, but what about the teacher as the one with the disability? First of all, it's a really good and important question. And, I have disabilities that affect my communication. And it's something I've had to think about how to incorporate into my teaching and how to find things that will work for me. Because the things that work for me are not always the things that work for non-disabled educators. And I think a lot of this still applies, which is that we need to do our telling job. We need to find ways of communicating with our learners that work well with the bodies and brains that we have. And we need to find ways of working to be understandable, which doesn't mean we have to be identical to non-disabled teachers. It just means we need to really attend to how understandable are we being, how do we know, how can we check, and to make sure that we're attending to our listening job, making sure that how can we listen to our learners in a way that will be work for us. And that may not be the way that non-disabled teachers do it, but we need to find some way of listening that works. Maybe that's, for some people that might mean we need people to write things down or sit in a particular way or repeat questions or check our understanding or any number of other possibilities, because disability is so diverse. But we need to find the methods the methods that will work for us. And I think the process of guessing and trial and error and the range of things worth trying is very similar, even if the point that gets us to can be different. Similar to that is talk to other disabled educators, because we all kind of have problems we've faced and strategies we've developed. And if we share them with each other, it can mean that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And even people whose disabilities are very different from yours may have found support strategies that work for them that would also work for you. So how do you feel about using visual supports with students with limited communication? Not only a visual schedule, but for making choices. So I think visual supports are really important. I also think that the way visual supports are implemented is often very problematic and can lock people into low expectations. I think that and it's tricky because what people really need is often something we're not going to be in a position to give them. Because when people need symbol supported expressive communication, like they need symbol support in order to be able to do their telling work, they need to be able to say more things than yes, no, thank you, bathroom, cookie, and I love you. And so let me see if I can actually get this up on my screen. Yes, I can. So there's an approach to supporting communication called core vocabulary. And I see your question, I'll attend to that too. So there's an approach called core vocabulary where you give people access to commonly used words and large numbers of words so that they can do complex communication, and that you don't wait for them to develop other skills first, because people can really get stuck in those smaller number of choice communication words. Like this kind of thing can be a trap, because if this is the only thing, this like very narrow range of choices is the only expressive communication someone's supported in, it can be seen as the only expressive communication they're capable of, or the only things they understand. And then there's another approach that can work very well for certain people with cognitive symbols. So I think that this can be very powerful, especially for people who are not literate and need support in doing this, or people who need cognitive support in accessing grammar. And this is often not something we're going to be in a position to give them. So I think that doing what we can and using visuals to support people in communicating things can be really powerful and important. And we should be careful that we're not assuming low expectations, and that it's not just choices, but it's also opinions. Another way that you can do that, and I know we have to end in a minute, but this is talking Matt's approach to doing it, is you can give someone a continuum where they can sort of drag it across and express opinions and non-binary things. But yes, like having people choose different visual scenarios can be a good thing. It is a tool worth trying. Just be careful about the assumptions you're making. Use anything that is available to you to try can be very worth trying. So I think the other thing you can do is use the room as the visual. Like if you're trying to figure out what somebody wants or needs or is thinking, having them point to stuff in the room can be really helpful. And I could go on and would like to, but we're over time and I want to attend to the next question as well. I do think trying different things with visuals, both expressively and receptively, I think can be really powerful. I do basically agree with you about that. So just want to acknowledge the challenge of trying to do two opposite things at the same time, slow and fast, simpler and technical. Or at the time that you tell a classroom of diverse learners that you will intentionally be doing this and why you are doing it. I hadn't thought to, but I should. Like, I think that it is always, not always, but often useful as educators to explain the assumptions we're making, because some people can help us check them. This is also something where I also want to acknowledge this is really hard. And this is something where small group instruction can make trial and error a lot more viable. Not necessarily grouping by ability or skill level, though not necessarily not that, but just if you have people in smaller groups, it can make it possible to try more things. And, but yes, I think that's a good point. I think that it is a very good idea to explain why you're trying different things. And even sometimes to check in with people, like faster or slower, easier or harder. So thank you for that. And I don't know why it didn't occur to me. So, all right, I think we need to end now because we're a few minutes over. But thank you to everyone for participating and for your questions. And if you have more, please feel free to email me. It's rabbi@matankids.org. And I hope to see you next month at our upcoming webinar. So again, so thank you very much, and please do fill out the evaluation so we can keep making these as useful to you as possible.